So yeah, hello also from my side. And here at this conference, we are all committed to the protection of workers. But the comprehensive protection of workers also includes the assessment of their overall exposure. But what is their overall exposure? My name is Marlene Dietz, and today I will introduce an exposure pathway to you which has received little attention so far. Recently, mainly inhalation and dermal exposure have been assessed, so the exposure via breathing or via the skin. The third exposure pathway I will talk about today is the oral exposure, so the intake via swallowing of hazardous substances. As this exposure pathway has received little attention so far, I will introduce the main perspectives of this exposure pathway first. Afterwards, we will discuss behavior and occupational hygiene practices, as well as the transfer of chemicals. These topics are very important for this exposure route, as you can imagine, contaminated hands in combination with contacts and behaviors between hand and mouth might lead to the emergence of oral exposure. Finally, I will give an overview on the status of the current state of knowledge of modeling and monitoring of oral exposure. Perspectives on oral exposure can be grouped into two fractions. First of all, the REACH guidance document R14 states that oral exposure does not need any quantitative assessment because it is sufficiently addressed due to occupational hygiene practices. On the other side, there are different scientific publications. One, for example, states that 15.6% of the UK working population is orally exposed. This is further investigated by parallel studies on the exposure, and those studies monitor the external exposure via dermal and inhalation measurements and the biomonitoring campaigns, so the internal exposure. And for example, a study from the electroplating industry monitoring nickel and chromium-6 values cannot explain the internal values of exposure only with dermal and inhalation exposure. So they assume that there must be a third exposure pathway, namely the oral exposure. This brings us to our conclusion that occupational oral exposure could be of relevance, and we therefore investigated it further. First of all, we searched for studies which investigate the behavior of adults, or especially workers. And behaviors we were able to identify are hand-mouth, hand-face, object-mouth, and object-face contacts, as well as hand-washing. The data we have are mainly frequencies, as you can see on the y-axis, given in 1 per hour. We summarized the values from the different studies as mean values, and the number of studies included is printed right next to the data points. The bars give the standard deviation between the different studies. One of our first observations is that the deviations are quite high. There are different reasons for this. First, quite technical reason is that the study design differs. There are surveys, there are observations, and another main reason is that the behavior varies not only between different workers, but also between one worker on different days and different situations, and so on. And for the error bar of the hand-face contacts, there's a third reason. Here, the nomenclature is not unique among the different studies. Some studies say the face is really the overall face. Some studies name the face, but they actually mean the perioral area or only the lips, so areas quite near to the mouth, which leads to further deviations. And by now, I would like to come to the values, but I don't want to name them all in detail. So one can easily identify hand-face contacts as the dominating frequency here. I would like to investigate this in more detail, and therefore we can distinguish different kinds of workplaces. However, the database only allows this for hand-mouth and hand-face contacts, as the database for workers or adults in general is quite limited. Workplaces which can be distinguished here are office workplaces and simulated workplaces. Simulated workplaces are those where, for example, doing nothing is an actual task to simulate boredom. And third, other workplaces, which summarizes mainly different industrial workplaces. Yeah, you can see that the simulated workplaces dominate the image, and as really doing nothing might not be the most realistic scenario, I would like to focus on office and industrial workplaces. Here, office workplaces lead to higher contact frequencies, both for hand-mouth and hand-face contacts. And the hypothesis to explain this is that during office work, your hands are not very busy. And when they are not busy, they are available for touching your face, for touching your mouth, and so on. So this is one reason why the frequencies are higher. Second, also the hand-face contacts are higher than the hand-mouth contacts for both workplace categories. And there are also multiple reasons for this. First of all, touching your face is part of gestures, of subconscious processes, or also due to stimuli like ticklings. Second, yeah, exactly. And so the hand-face contacts are more frequent than other contacts. And this data led us to the conclusion that there is behavior and occupational hygiene practice which can lead to the emergence of oral exposure, and therefore it has to be further studied, especially for adults, to investigate it further. By now, I would like to come to a second aspect of oral exposure, the transfer of chemicals. The transfer is described with so-called transfer efficiencies, and formally they are defined as the amount of transferred mass over the overall mass. With this concept, the transfer is described along different zones. For example, from a surface to my hand, from my hand to the perioral region, and from the perioral region to the oral cavity. Experimentally, this is determined by contaminating, for example, a hand with a known amount of substance. This known amount of substance is then brought into contact with the second surface, for example, the face, and afterwards, the dermal exposure of the face is investigated following chemical analysis. And when you know when the amount of initial contamination is known, as well as the dermal exposure after the transfer, the calculation can be done to determine the transfer efficiency for this specific situation. This already brings me to the first modeling approach to describe oral exposure. The modeling is done by the description of the mass transfer along such zones. And simpler models use the zones of the contamination source, the surface contaminant, hands and arms layers, and the perioral area or the oral cavity itself. More complex models add the air and the outer and inner clothing contaminants. However, it is not always necessary to simulate all the zones, so there are models which skip single or multiple of the zones, as demonstrated with these arrows here. Now I would like to come to a second modeling approach. This is to use substance-specific estimations. They are based on dermal measurements, and again, the transfer is calculated afterwards. However, dermal measurements are usually very specific to substances and situations, and therefore further developments could be to use dermal databases as they are currently being developed, for example, at BAuA, or model-based descriptions for the dermal exposure. A third modeling approach comes from the consumer context. Here, often the ingestion rate itself is assumed, or it is estimated from the amount of applied product. In combination with the chemical concentration of the substance of concern, the amount of the ingested substance can be calculated. In addition to modeling, also measuring is an option to assess the occupational exposure, and therefore I brought this very simplified workplace here. I want to explain the measurement approaches in two main groups. And the first group deals with the emergence of oral exposure. And as already mentioned, assessing the dermal exposure is one of the main approaches in combination with later modeling techniques. So especially the hand and the perioral region are used to estimate the oral exposure. In addition, also the surface contamination can be used, as this is one of the starting points of the contamination of, for example, my hand. Issues with these approaches are that it is only the transfer pathway which can lead to oral exposure, which is assessed here, and it is only a snapshot of the amount of substances which is currently being transformed. Everything which is transported earlier, hours ago, is not necessarily captured with these methods. And that is where the second group of models comes into the game. And these try to explain the already occurred oral exposure. Studies, for example, suggest to analyze the saliva or to perform mouth rinses. Also, further biomonitoring campaigns are a general option. And a very, very old paper suggests to analyze vomitus or stomach washes, only included for the sake of completeness here today. And All of these pathways, or all of these methods, have the issue that it is hard to distinguish the different exposure pathways. So dermal, inhalation, and oral exposure all come together in our bodies, leading to difficulties in distinction. This also goes into the direction of the metabolism, which is an issue and has to be investigated with these methods. The saliva method also has the issue that the saliva flows in our mouths, and therefore it is again really only a snapshot. This brings me to the summary and the outlook. We saw that oral exposure in the workplace can be of relevance, especially from biomonitoring studies. And there are multiple influencing factors, like the behavior or like the transfer efficiencies. There are different modeling concepts available, but the input parameters are very complex and the approaches themselves are still limited, which is also true for the measuring approaches due to their many issues. Therefore, we really have a need for simpler modeling and improved monitoring. And with this, I would like to thank you, and I would like to answer your questions.